Hey everyone, and welcome back to Breaking the Spell. So I know it's been a while that we have done a video. We have been having some trouble getting some guests on the show, but in order to to account for that, since we couldn't get someone on the show, so we decided to do a book review. And I'm really happy to talk about this book, which just came out quite earlier this year, and it's a really interesting philosophy book, which is very practical as well and covers topics and themes that are very pertinent in today's times, things to do with the body. So the book itself is called Intact, A Defense of the Unmodified Body. And here it is, my hardbound copybook. So this book is written by Clare Chambers. So Clare Chambers is this professor of philosophy and fellow at Jesuit College at the University of Cambridge. And, as a feminist philosopher, she's someone who's interested in feminist theory, contemporary liberal theory, theories of social justice, social construction, and bioethics. She's written quite a number of other books like Against Marriage and Egalitarian Defense of the Marriage-Free State, Sex, Culture, and Justice, Limits of Choice, Teaching Yourself Political Philosophy. So you kind of see, the kind of specialty that she has. And this book is one, her most recent one and one that I really enjoyed reading. So why do I want to talk about this book? So essentially, I think, all of us can see that there's a lot of pressure on us right now, right? Like in where we live, in terms of the culture, the societal norms that we inhabit. There's a lot of pressure for us to modify our bodies, right? So I'm not just talking about simply trying to eat and exercise with a healthy body, but, we have conversations about like cosmetic surgery, anti-aging, and maybe even modifying your body digitally, right? Like even on Instagram, using filters and stuff like that. So, that's like on a simpler level, but on a more complex level, there's also the politics of the body. So let's talk about things like disability rights or access to basic goods. Obviously in America, there's also this very fervent debate about trans rights as well, and that has kind of instigated some kind of moral panic about their acceptance and assimilation into public space. Now, for me, the other reason why I'm so interested in this topic is because, like, on a personal level, I saw this proliferation of arguments, made by members of the fitness community and the anti-vax community, where they said that, it's morally preferable for people to not get vaccinated. And if they, suffer or they die due to catching COVID, it's their own fault, because the idea here is that it was due to them not taking care of themselves. They could be obese, which is something they were happy to point out. They even come up with statistics about how obese people are more likely to suffer from COVID, and we shouldn't sacrifice the economy because of them. So, like I said, there's this logic that's working through here. This idea that it is sort of preferable to modify the body through exercise, eating clean, and if you're not doing that, and you get caught in this pandemic, oh well, it sucks, right? Too bad for you. So anyway, thankfully we're not so somewhat in the heat of the pandemic. We're kind of coming out of it, but nevertheless, I think these interests are pertinent, right? And so, and we are kind of professionally having these discussions all the time, right? Because our bodies mean so much to us. Just a very quick example. So I don't know about two of you, obviously on Santosh, but basically, like Taylor Swift had this music video. So if you don't know who Taylor Swift is, pop artist, right? That's very up and come. That is really popular with the youth. And she had this music video where she stepped on a weighing scale, and the weighing scale showed the word fat. And this scene was actually meant to convey her fears and inner demons. And being fat is obviously one of them for celebrity like her. But there was this huge backlash, presumably from the fans. And what they were talking about is that, that scene sort of promoted fat phobia or fat shaming. And so they had to edit that scene out, and instead of eating fat, it beats the title of the song. So anyway, the point here is that I think we're always going to see controversies like this. So in any case, right, before I start talking about the book, right, and like I said, although the subtitle here is A Defense of the Unmodified Body, but just to be really clear, because there's a possibility of being misconstrued, misconstruing the argument of the book, it doesn't mean that Clare Chambers is attacking the idea of modifying the body. So she's not actually saying that, like, there's something wrong with trying to do something to your body. And in any case, right, it's very hard to not have an unmodified body, right? So just the idea that we are choosing to sit down here, talk on Zoom, when we could be exercising, we could be squatting, we could be doing something else. I mean, the point is that every second of your life, you are modifying your body some way or another. So, and our body is also changing whether you like it or not, right? So we age, we get sick, we suffer from aches and pains that we don't really know what the source of, simple things like cutting your hair, trimming your nails. So we are constantly modifying our body. But, what is the main aim of the book is that the body should be accepted as good as it is, and that we should live in a society that treats our body, without some kind of arbitrary standard, and that we shouldn't be made to feel, bad or wrong about bodies. And that's why, even in the introduction for book, she writes the title, "Your Body is Never Good Enough," and that is the question that we have to face. We are always made to feel like as if our bodies are not good enough. And what Clare Chambers is trying to say, no, it's not that our bodies are wrong. It's what society tells us that is wrong with our bodies that we should examine and that we should look at. So I'm going to basically, for the structure of this, review, there's basically three parts to her book. So the first one deals with the theme of naturalness. What is it like to have a natural body? What does it mean to have a natural body? And is there more to meet the eye in defining what is natural? The second theme is about normality. So what does it mean to have a normal body? And that deals a lot with disability, impairment, reconstruction. So that gets a little bit more niche, but I'll try to go through that as well. And the last theme is basically about the whole body, and what does it mean to have a whole body, and how should we think deeper about modification. So before I actually get started, let's get your views. So first thing, tell me maybe some preemptive thoughts, right? What are your thoughts about this body, about your body, or have you thought about the body? And have you ever had doubts about your body? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I resonate with this idea that society does have these standards of the body, which once in a while we feel some pressure to either match or conform to. But I guess for myself, I feel I've been relatively fortunate in that I don't think I've ever experienced the pressure to the point where it made me dysfunctional in any way. I think it's always been manageable. And I think the most common way it manifests for me is just wanting to be healthy, I think. So yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that she's even bringing up, or you are bringing up, health as maybe like a natural standard or something that we should question. Because yeah, I mean, up to now, I guess I've always just assumed that health is a good thing to aspire to anyway. So I'd be interested to explore that.
Cool. Santosh?
Yeah, I think growing up, I was quite insecure about my own body. Yeah, so it could be maybe in two dimensions. First is my height. I was relatively short. Yeah. And then secondly is the color of my skin. Yeah, so like I'm brown, right? So I'm Indian, and Indian, like the brown skin is not the norm. Yeah, and so when I see like the norm being other color skin, then I become more self-conscious. Yeah, so I think growing up, there was a significant amount of self-consciousness to my body. And this is like, it's just so amazing. The recent book launched by Aware, Growing Up Indian. Yeah, on the cover of the book, oh my gosh, that image will never leave me. It's that of an Indian girl, and then like her legs are exposed, and then yeah, there is a soap that's trying to recolor her brown skin into a lighter tone of brown, and like I remember seeing my mom growing up trying to put on this Fair and Lovely cream, which is a bestseller in India, yeah, like it's so crazy, like the kind of norms that we have about beauty, right? Cultural norms about beauty. So that was fascinating. I think only like in my 30s where I read more about Indian philosophy, where Vedanta philosophy posits that my identity is not myself is not identified with the body. Like, I'm not this body actually. I'm not this body and I'm not this mind. I have falsely believed my identity to be tagged to this body and mind. And that was very freeing for me. And that started the whole journey of healing and to disidentify with my body. Yeah. And that was very freeing. Yeah. When I see myself as a soul and everyone else as a soul.
Yeah, I have to say, I thought of you a little bit when I was reading this book, right? Because I know this is a very close narrative, very deep attached narrative that you have about how you're trying to disassociate from your body, right? And I like the example you gave where, your mom is applying this basically whitening cream, right? And it's not even just, relatable just to brown people. I mean, even Chinese people try to do that, right? Chinese women are always constantly made to feel like as if, you've got to be more fair, and being more fair is more beautiful. So, we are actually under this, especially for women, and it's a bit of a shame that we don't have a woman in our discussion today. But, there's a great chunk of the book, obviously since it's written by a woman philosopher, a female philosopher. So there's so much content there about the feelings and the ambiguities and complexities of trying to deal with a world that is trying to shape them, right, as with what is considered normal to have a female body, or what is normal to have a certain standard of beauty for women. So, sad to say it's three guys here, but we will try our best, to still nevertheless, include, the idea of women in our discussions as well, and at the same time, speak about our personal perspectives, and Santosh, that was a great way of sharing it. And with Unsu, yeah, I think that's the thing also with some of us, right? Like, we may not have to feel that way about ourselves in our histories, but we shouldn't forget that other people have felt that way about their bodies, this, disconnection or this discomfort. And I'm hoping in our discussion we can try to see how we can facilitate making them feel better, and as people, how can we include them more in our discussions? So, okay, why don't I get to the first part? And so the first theme basically is about the natural body, right? And just a very quick thing, right? A quick way of introducing this idea. So I think for all of us, we feel like it's very intuitive to think what a natural body is, right? We see ourselves as, Clare Chambers put it in this way, like, unlike animals, we have intellect, we have morals, we have will, and in that sense, we're different from animals, but, in some sense, we also like animals, right? Because we have hunger, thirst, vulnerability, to pain and disease, stuff like that. And, for human beings, we can ask this question, right, about nature versus nurture. And, everything that we see in our world, right, we can always ask, is this actually the way we are meant to be naturally, or is it because we've done something to it, right? And that includes our bodies as well. So to her, right, the idea is that the natural body is supposed to be the body if things are left the way they are, right? And if you just kind of let nature do its work, the natural body is kind of like the default, or it's the body that's without. But, like I just mentioned just now in the introduction, it's a bit hard to even imagine this being even plausible in the first place, because it's impossible for our bodies to kind of stay natural all the time, right? The moment we do something to our bodies, like I mentioned, we transform it into a product of human interference. So the body stops kind of like being natural once we consciously do something to it. We feed it, we clothe it, we move it, So what she's trying to say is that, this is not a very straightforward question, right? Whether the body is natural, right? It's a very useful concept, but it's very slippery because, what do we mean when we say something is natural? So take even simple examples, like, if you shower versus you do dry showering versus, you have a haircut, or you have a bikini wax, or, you brush your teeth, or you put on lipstick and makeup, right? What is the value of a natural body in this kind of cases? So I will tell you first thing, the number one reason why I like this book is because the book actually opens with a chapter on bodybuilding. And so this is a topic that obviously is close to my heart because in case viewers you don't know, I'm a fitness instructor, and bodybuilding is kind of like my entry point into the fitness world. And what Clare Chambers does in this book is that she talks about the difference between natural bodybuilding and unnatural bodybuilding. And I wish she was on our channel because I would give her a lot of credit for getting everything factually right about bodybuilding, and she goes through a lot of history and the nuances of the practice. So just because I don't expect the two of you guys to know about bodybuilding that well, so I just share a few things, right? Like she notes that, for example, the difference between natural and unnatural bodybuilding is that in unnatural bodybuilding, or what I prefer to call professional bodybuilding, people use steroids and growth hormones, right? In natural bodybuilding, you don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. But nevertheless, right, these athletes, right, they still use things like supplements, so protein powder, creatine, all these other different sport supplements. So she also asked the question, I mean, do you call these things natural? I mean, they are actually quite unnatural methods, right? And there's a lot of unnatural things that bodybuilders do, like they put on tanning lotion before they go on stage. They, drastically try to strip their body of water, so that way they appear very ripped and very lean on stage. So the idea that she asked, right, is that, what really is the difference between natural and unnatural bodybuilding? Because all these artificial things are still in it. So how she actually tries to, and this is a great insight, is that, natural bodybuilding actually comes closest to the ideal of masculinity. And so this is why, in our culture, there's a certain valuation, a certain sort of esteem attached to natural bodybuilding, because it comes closest to what we think is a masculine body, and comes closest to being the ideal man. So the idea here is that when you look at a natural bodybuilder, and an unnatural bodybuilder basically, suffers a lot of side effects, because they have a bloated belly, they have lower testosterone production, so it's quite possible that they have shrunken balls, just as a matter of fact. So the idea here is that when it comes to professional bodybuilding, there's a sort of virtual reality here that has kind of become a sort of cult, and that's what she says, where the strength of that bodybuilder is actually an illusion, and that's not something a lot of people know, which is when you see a bodybuilder on stage, actually he's at his weakest, because he's so weak, he's so tired, he has hardly any food, he has hardly any water, just to appear that cut on stage. But that is the irony of it, because actually you think that they're the strongest at that point, but they're not. So there's a certain, like I said, mysticism around it. So in any case, right, the idea here is that how she ends on that chapter is to say that, look, so bodybuilding is naturally a kind of body modification. Obviously, it is by default, right? But when she went to attend like bodybuilding contests and try to immerse herself in the community, she could see that, at least everyone's kind of self-aware. Everyone's aware that they're pursuing a certain ideal. They know they'll be judged, and they know that this is not actually very ordinary. Most ordinary people do not bodybuild in this manner. And so she kind of ends that chapter saying that, look, you could, in terms of physical health, you could do a lot worse than being a natural bodybuilder. Like, to her, it's better to be a natural bodybuilder than someone who doesn't exercise. It's even better to be a natural bodybuilder than an unnatural one, right? And she can see like there's even certain mental health benefits with natural bodybuilding. There's a very supportive community. It's very inspiring, and it's a certain way of trying to meet masculinity ideals, but yet still work on your self-esteem. And but nevertheless, right, she also does point out, right, that masculinity has an ideal. You cannot assess this without also looking at the broader system of gender, and how masculinity can be toxic as well. She doesn't deny that, but it doesn't have to be. And being a man is also being compatible with being virtue and vice, flourishing and suffering. So masculinity can vary in its content and value, and so it's also the idea of naturalness that operates with it. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first chapter, which, like I said, very, very closely relatable to someone like me. Then basically the next thing she talks about is nature as a frenemy, and it's very applicable to women. So she notes that, of course, for women, nature is not very kind to them, because there's pregnancy, there's childbirth, there's menstruation, and she notes that vast majority of women do suffer period pain. And the most important point that she draws to here, and it's something that I think is very relatable also for us in our culture, is that menstruation tends to be discussed and shamed and concealed. And so she comes up with this idea about shametenance. Shametenance is basically like a kind of phenomena where not only do you feel shamed by your own actions, but by your own status as well. And it is this distress apprehension of the self that's inadequate or diminished. So the idea is that shametenance, it has to be maintained by a system of gender hierarchy, and it is, maintained through a vast variety of ways, from legal structures, economic inequality, media portrayals, and family life. Okay, so anyway, the idea here, right, is that, I'll talk about this idea about shametenance, right? And I think for all of us, we can understand what is going on for women nowadays when it comes to the menstruation, right? Which is they're usually forced to conceal, like when they are menstruating, that they certain social taboos around it as well, like there's certain things they shouldn't touch, certain things they shouldn't do. And so what Clare Chambers is interested to talk about here is that, if you want to value the unmodified body, we have to refuse to perform or maintain shametenance, the practice of shametenance, right? For women in particular, they have to kind of like refuse to accept their bodies are not good enough, and not look at their bodies as if when they're menstruating, like as if it's gross or unnatural or disgusting. And so, but the thing here, as Clare Chambers points out, is that, menstruation is a very natural part for a woman. And so in that sense, it's always in that sense like a friend and an enemy, because, at the same time, you're trying to work against, societal oppression and hierarchy, but, the body can also, as in like, you have this very ambiguous relationship with your own body. So one very interesting case where she points out where a woman actually tries to reject shametenance was in 2015, where this marathon runner, Kiran Gandhi, she ran the marathon without menstruation protection so that she can avoid the chafing and the discomfort of tampons. And there was basically an image of her crossing the finishing line with blood stains on her thighs, and that kind of made international news. And so, this is a very powerful act, of not trying to submit to shametenance. Another way of looking at it also is with natural birth, right? This course that we have about, women should have a natural birth. And Clare Chambers again recognizes there's very contradictory aspects of it, right? Where there's a need to women need to be liberated from a male-dominated, over-medicalized health industry, but it can also be a way for women to subjugate other women to feel bad if, they're not able to perform, say, natural breastfeeding, or they don't have a natural birth. But, like she points out, what birth is natural. Even in as purely natural a birth that a woman has, there's always like other interventions, there's midwives, like there is no pure natural state, right, where this occurs. So, the point here that I want to, that she makes and she emphasizes is that she's not trying to say, obviously, that natural birth is morally superior to other births, or, women have a duty to try to have natural births, right? Or C-section should be thought of as a failure. But it's just really to emphasize the power of this normative ideals of naturalness that we have over us and how they do relate to gender, what we think a man or a woman should be trying to do. More simpler examples or more quotidian cases like, natural hair, women putting on makeup, whether, light makeup, no makeup, or heavy makeup, right? There's always this debate around, like, what is nature, what is natural, or what is cultural. And to Clare Chambers, it's always kind of sort of in opposition, right? That nature and culture kind of always clashes. But she wants to point out that nature as a concept is also fully dependent on culture. And so because of that interrelationship, what is natural will vary because depending on the culture you're in. So I'm going to finish up this section just to say that there's two other chapters, very heavy chapters, that goes deep into feminist philosophy. And because in feminist philosophy, there's always this perpetual discussion about, do we fight against nature or do we reclaim nature, right? And there's a lot for me to go through, so I won't try to do that. But because Santosh, you open up our introduction by saying that you try to reject the body, or you try to not see your body, right, as necessary and essential part of your identity. So I want to quote this part of the book that I like, and I think we can have a very fruitful discussion on this. So here's what she says, right? We can't deny the materiality of the body. Bodies do things of their own accord, things which may liberate or constrain. Bodies age, they hunger, they put on weight, they menstruate, gestate, lactate, ejaculate, right? Bodies cry, sigh, sleep, lie awake, and wonder. Our bodies exist. They do things even without our culture's intervention, right? But culture inexorably does matter. It transforms
our real material bodies into subjects and objects, liberated and oppressed. It elevates some bodies and demeans others. And she notes, right, like that if men menstruate, right, we probably will see a very huge reversal of cultural valuation. Maybe, if men menstruate, then there'll be a badge of honor for men, or, who menstruate the right way, or, maybe period pain will be treated more seriously, right? So the idea here is that, like, there's this, like I say, relationship. And so she says anyway, basically, that the idea is that she wants to cling on to is that she wants to say that, bodies are real, right? They do exist independently of our minds. They are the basic conditions for us even having a mind. But what we want to look at is embodiment, right? That we are also our bodies, and we cannot escape our bodily needs. We cannot experience the world through anything else except our bodies, and the idea here is that bodies also, for us, create commonalities and differences of experience, right? We can never truly know what it's like to exist in another person's body, but we can share our embodied experiences and find comfort and solidarity in similarities, as well as a greater awareness of social structures of power and freedom. So there's a lot more that she says about culture, but basically what she's trying to say is that we need some kind of egalitarian valuing of all bodies, right? And that comes up later in the later part of the discussion, right? So whether male, female, or any gender, the idea here is that we need to see what kind of bodies are devalued, right? And in this case, we're just talking about women, but there are many other kinds of bodies that are also devalued as well. And how can we, boost the value of these other bodies as well that are marginalized and they're not treated as the default or the natural body. So that's about it for this part. So let me first ask you guys a question, right? So what do you think of the idea of a natural body? And when people say that they prefer doing something naturally, right? So it could be something like growing a cold, it could be like losing weight, it could be about looking pretty. What comes through your mind when you hear people elicit such thoughts?
Santosh, you want to go first?
I think, I facilitate authentic relating community conversations, in civil society, right? And a huge part of the work I'm doing is allowing people to share what's in their inner landscape, to reveal that to other people. Yeah, so it's not so much about what the natural body is, but what people are feeling subjectively within themselves with regards to the naturalness of their body, and to communicate that inner landscape to other people, so people can understand and empathize with as many lived experiences, subjective lived experiences of inner worlds or inner landscapes of as a diverse group of people in society. Yeah, so I think there's too much of a fixation on what's going on outside. So the examples that you've mentioned, right, which is bodybuilding or menstruation, yeah, there's a lot of fixation on that, but not about what people are feeling internally with regards to menstruation or bodybuilding. And the space for discourse should shift away from the external appearances to what people are feeling within themselves. A wonderful modality for conflict resolution and mediation is nonviolent communication. And a very important part of nonviolent communication is revealing one's feelings, emotions, and needs, and making requests of their needs very clear to other members of society. Yeah, so I think the only thing I would like to add to the wonderful discussion that we've had, right, or the wonderful expose you've had of the book, right, is that I think we need to communicate our inner landscapes more. Yeah.
Okay, I can't necessarily agree with what you're saying, because I think maybe I'm not, articulating this well enough for you as well. Yeah. But like everything I just talked about just now is meant to be also a discussion about the internal experiences of these people. So whether it's the bodybuilders, whether it's women who go through menstruation, and just to put it in context, right? Like when I mentioned that thing about the the woman marathoner, the female marathon runner, right? Like the idea here is that, you know, she uses this as a good example of a woman, you know, really having to fight against, you know, the social taboos around menstruation, like a woman should be running and, you know, having period blood coming out, right, when she's doing something athletic. And there may other examples as well. So I'm not doing this enough due justice, but the idea here is that I think what Clare Chambers is trying to say is that we should focus on their internal subjective experiences. And you know, the idea is that they do go through these things for real, right? When you live in a, say, society that tells you you shouldn't cook when you're menstruating, for example, I mean, you know, that's a very subjective, you know, kind of feeling of injustice or unfairness, right? And that's quite discriminatory. So, you know, that's what I think she's trying to invoke here, that these women deserve to have a voice out there and to reclaim their bodies. So yeah, so I hope that kind of makes sense. Yeah. So, Unsu?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate very much with what Santosh said as far as like understanding the body as an inner experience. You know, I think a lot of these issues come about because, you know, ever since the philosopher Descartes had this mind-body split, right? He introduced mind-body dualism. And because of that, I think ever since then, we've almost looked at our bodies as machines. I mean, like Descartes, you know, thought animals were just intricate machines. And when his students were dissecting animals and animals were screaming, he told the students, don't worry about the screaming. They can't feel anything. They're just machines. And I think slowly, ever since then, we've come to look at our own bodies as like, yeah, just things to manipulate. So I think the key to what Clare Chambers is trying to do, which is like introduce like a more egalitarian way of looking at bodies, is to go back to like what it is to have an inner experience of a body, and you know, to really ask ourselves some deep questions like, what is a body? There's so many ways of describing what a body is. Is it just a collection of organs and skin? Are our bodies actually like our connection to a 4 billion year history of evolution? You know, are our bodies like connected to the cosmic spirals in the universe? You know, yeah, there's so many, like, depending on how you look at the body, like it very much shapes, you know, just our social and political relations with regards to the body. So yeah, I mean, I know your original question was about like, what is natural versus unnatural? And I don't know, to me, I feel that distinction is not as interesting to explore as this distinction between looking at the bodies from the outside and looking at bodies from the inside.
Yeah, so later on, I will talk a bit about what she calls the internal perspective. And this will come up later in the idea about normality. So, you know, how do people feel normals about their body? So this will in some sense address what you guys are talking about, you know, does she actually care about the internal perspective? And she very much does. But I think the point that I'm trying to draw here is that, you know, the outside cultural practices and pressures and how other people look at you, what she calls also the external perspective, you know, it's not something you can just wish away. It's not like you can pretend they don't exist. They do. And another important thing that she makes, and I'm kind of jumping the gun a little bit here, is that she's not saying that, you know, having cultural values about femininity or masculinity is wrong in itself. There is nothing wrong with that. There are maybe good reasons why, you know, we want to have certain norms about, you know, the body being like this or like that and having certain practices, right? But it's just more like she wants to invite us to have a critique about these norms, to think, to reflect deeper on them. In this chapter as well, just to share a little bit, like she obviously talks a lot about how, you know, women have gone through, you know, in history, right, very oppressive practices, for example, binding their feet, you know, wearing corsets, right? So yeah, these things are like, you know, very real practices that people have, you know, conceptualized and implemented on a wide scale. And the idea here is that, like I said, you know, women are constantly fighting against this because they want to ask, you know, like, what is natural for a woman to feel like, right? What kind of body should she have, and what kind of body she is entitled to own and to claim? So yeah, I'll just ask one more thing for you guys, right? What do you think maybe is problematic about the way that, you know, our current discourse is about our bodies, and it can relate to the theme of naturalness, but if you don't want to, it's also fine. But, do you think there are any problems right now with the way we talk about the body?
Could you be a bit more specific, like discourse in what spaces?
Okay, let me maybe give you one example, and I hope this example will help to, prompt something in you. So, okay, obviously, I'm the more athletic one here, but the idea here is that, like, if you look at, say, popular culture, or look at the way we talk about what having a healthy body is, there's usually this imagination or conception that there's only one type of body that's athletically the best, and that has kind of evolved over time. I think in the 80s, Arnold Schwarzenegger and the much more steroid. At the time, they didn't confess, they didn't open up to the idea that they were using steroids, but now we know. But the idea is that it was held up as kind of like the ideal body to have, right? And this especially for men, this is the kind of body you should have. Then over time, that's kind of shifted because, now that we know the raw truth about what was happening back then, now there's different preferences about what a man's body should look like. But I still feel like this is, still not satisfactory because overall in this discussion, right, to me, there is still this idea that there's only one kind of body that is the best. And especially in the world of sports and athletics, what you see is that, people are born with very diverse bodies and we don't value or even acknowledge that enough. So one article that I saw, which was really good at pointing this out, was when they showed all the different Olympic athletes in different sports, right? So there's one for track and field, there's one for weightlifting, there's one for, hockey or whatever. And you can see all the different kinds of bodies out there. And no one asked the question, like, is this body more desirable than the other body? Is this body less fit or less healthy than the other body? And, like I said, what is problematic to me is that we don't acknowledge and sort of like see it as it's okay to have a body that's very different from someone else and still claim it as something that is, even if you don't want to use the word natural, but it's still something that is good enough, right? So that's one, example I have in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think so much about standards for male bodies, but for sure for women that, there is a certain standard that is promoted through like fashion magazines and advertising. And I think, there was a really good law that was passed in France, where they banned touching up photos in fashion magazines.
Yep.
So yeah, something like that I think is a step in the right direction where we're not creating artificial standards for women to match.
Santosh, you got any thoughts? Something that maybe you feel that's problematic?
I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about this because I've not really been affected by male depictions of the ideal depictions of the masculine or the male body, right? Like it's never, I think for me, the work I'm doing, like my kind of gym is like the inner work that I'm doing, right? Like the fact that someone else has a better sculpted body doesn't really matter to me. Like I don't really feel it affects me anymore. Because I feel like I'm on a different journey altogether, and like it's an inner work, right? And my inner work is a lot about like understanding my emotions, my feelings, learning to process traumas, learning to work through and compost. Just to feel lighter, just to feel freer in my being. Yeah, so I don't know. I think like, I'm just not a good gauge or example or a good person to ask this question. My idea of a gym is that there are many kinds of gym, and the kind of gyms that I'm going to is like the emotional kind of gym, like the social emotional learning or literacy kind of gym, or the mindfulness meditative kind of gym. So it's just a different perspective to the body.
Yep, that's fine. I mean, there are people like you who really don't think very much about this topic, and that's fine.
Yeah, and there are
But,
people like me who don't even watch and look at these magazines, and yeah, they're not affected.
yeah. I mean, look, I think, what you present, in terms of who you are today, right, is because of this kind of internal work that you've done. But for some people, it might not work for them. That's one thing, just to say out, just as a matter of fact, right? But also because, like I said, the bodies do matter to people. And let me go to the other examples, and I think maybe it becomes much more salient because
you're
we're
right.
still talking in the realm of very normal bodies like you, me, and all that, right? But
Yeah.
later I'm going to give you some much more richer examples and a lot more, thought-provoking, actually.
Yeah. No, I think I have a vested interest in how my two nephews were growing up, who will be exposed to magazines and their pop culture, how they will feel about their bodies. And I think I just want to give them the reassurance that, there's intrinsic worth and value to their being, irrespective of how their body is and how their body compares to all these images and standards and norms. Yeah. So I think, it's just about the felt experience that I'm concerned about with regards to my two nephews who will be exposed to such things. That's what I'm vested interest in.
Yeah, actually, I was to say, don't just think about your nephews, right? Even when I'm reading this book, I'm not thinking just about myself, right? I know I mentioned the natural bodybuilding thing, but I'm not even a bodybuilder. But the idea is that I'm thinking about other people as well. I'm thinking about women in particular. I'm thinking about, soon there'll be a topic about children. There's going to be topics about deaf people. So I'm also thinking in that respect as well. Yeah. Okay, why don't I just get to the second part? So like I said, the second part is really about normality, right? And, some very simple question is to ask ourselves, is our body normal, right? And you may, maybe not for Santosh, but maybe for the rest of us, we may feel like we ask ourselves this question, like, is our body natural compared to other men? Or for women, how is my face, normal? Or is my, is the things that I do to my body normal? Whether it's like, cutting hair, whether it's removing hair from your armpits. For men, maybe they're thinking other men have a six-pack. Why don't I have a six-pack? Is it normal? So stuff like that, right? But a very important point that, Clare Chambers points out is that we need to realize that when we talk about normality, the opposite concept, right, is abnormality, right? And abnormality is associated with, disease or unwanted or deviant, right? And that in itself comes with a certain value judgment, right? And what has been considered abnormal or a disease has changed over time, right? So masturbation used to be considered a disorder. Homosexuality was once considered a mental illness, right? So we can see that what is normal has morphed and changed, right? In terms of its valuation over time. And so what she wants to help us to do is to think of this idea that when we talk about normality, there's always a reference class. So usually we use statistics. So statistics, will tell you on average, people are X or Y or something like that, right? But also think of it in terms of physical characteristics as well. So obviously it's not normal for a man to get pregnant, to, gestate a fetus and stuff like that. But that's also true of other conditions, right? So a deaf person who's born from birth, not able to hear, a blind person who's born from birth, not able to see, like for them, being normal is not being able to see or hear. And even for, say, autism, not being able to understand very clearly other people's feelings and emotions is also sort of normal for them. And so, she's asking us to think very critically about how, when we talk about normality, right, is usually based on certain culture of political, cultural values. And, once we can see that normality is actually based on these cultural assumptions, right, then we can kind of scrutinize, this concept of normality. And so to her, what she's trying to say is that normality, is never neutral, right? And of course, the stuff that we do to our body, or these modifications, they have a certain political value, and so they are politically significant. So the first example that I'm going to talk about, which comes out in the book, is very fascinating, is to do with the idea about cultural versus cosmetic surgery. So think something like circumcision or female genital mutilation, FGM, right? And there are cases, examples of people where they opt to do this culturally, for cultural reasons, religious reasons. And there's also the other spectrum where it's done for cosmetic reasons. So meaning that you want to make your body appear, more beautiful or less ugly. And what she's trying to say here is that even though it may seem like both concepts are very distinct from each other, the truth is that they kind of overlap a lot. And one example she brings up, it's a little bit, I mean, we are in Singapore, but she's using the UK context where they have this Female Genital Mutilation Act, and she says that, you know, they actually don't allow women to have, you know, this surgery performed on them for cultural reasons. But the act still allows women to do it for cosmetic reasons, especially for people who are intersex. So the idea that she's trying to invoke here is that, you know, even in the case where we think something is done for a cosmetic reason, it's actually kind of culturally, it's also based on certain assumption of a cultural norm, right? About, hey, you know, the person should look like this. So, you know, it's still okay to do this particular surgery, even if we don't allow it for, you know, religious reasons. So going back to what actually Unsu was saying just now, right? So she points out that, you know, globalization is obviously, you know, homogenized our standards and our views about beauty, right? Especially for women, right? But that's why all the more we need to think deeper about our culture and how important culture is, because it determines, you know, how important beauty is and what's kind of beauty is more important than function. So to kind of show you this example, right? And this is a really interesting one. So she quotes the work of this political scientist, Courtney Smith, who did interviews with American and Senegalese women about breast implants and FGM. And, you know, with each respective community, she asked them about their feelings about it. So with the Senegal women, she asked them about breast implantation, and with Americans, obviously, about FGM. Now, of course, with the American women, you expect them to be aghast and disgusted with the idea about FGM, right? But with the Senegal women, they were actually just as disturbed by, you know, breast implants. And they were, you know, doubly shocked to hear that this is a very normal practice. And the reason why they felt that way, right, even though some of these women, by the way, have experienced, you know, FGM, is that because they treat the breast as a very important purpose to the nourishing of offspring. You know, breastfeeding is obviously to their culture a very important part of being a woman and being a mother. So in that sense, right, you can see this cultural divide where for the Senegal women, right, the breasts are considered very fundamental to womanhood, and for American women, on the other hand, you know, breasts are sort of considered a little bit more important for appearance and for standards of beauty, right? And the idea here is that, you know, this shows how cultural values can really change your ideas about, like, you know, what you deem acceptable or to be normal to do to your body. Yeah. So there's also another interesting one for men in particular. She says that actually when it comes to circumcision, apparently in the US, it's treated very routinely. There's a lot more men in the US who are circumcised versus men in the UK. And again, it goes back to this idea about cultural acceptance as well. Now, like I said just now already, that, you know, when we talk about such things, right, this kind of cultural differences and how, you know, what she calls that we can have normative position about these practices, right? She wants to emphasize again that, you know, there's a lot of complex questions we can have about this practices, because it's not just about saying that it's wrong or right, you know. I mean, you know, people have to make very difficult decisions about, like, let's not take the two examples I just gave, right? But let's say, you know, if you have to opt for, say, a life-saving surgery, you know, that may fundamentally change your body and make it more abnormal, for example, right? There are also treatments that sometimes we have to do just to get rid of chronic pain that may shorten our life. So these are all very complicated, controversial, difficult questions, and people should be entitled to value, you know, what is important for them, you know, in terms of their health and what kind of treatment protocols. And that can also be related to religious values as well, like if they believe in an afterlife, right? So, and whether they regard suffering as whether it's something noble or something senseless. So again, that comes into play when they decide about what to do with their bodies. So anyway, the point here being made, again, just to re-emphasize, is that we're not saying that, you know, some values are wrong, or some values are bad and others. It's just really that, you know, just take this very simple example she gives, right? Even though genocide, you know, slavery, corporal punishment, values that existed in the past, right? That doesn't make it more right than it is today, right? So it doesn't do anything to undermine, you know, the idea that we find it morally repugnant right now. Yeah. So the next part actually is about disability. And so this is a very interesting one as well. So I'll just give a very quick recap of this, a quick summary of this. So I said just now about deaf people, right? So we are now in this situation where for deaf children, parents have a right to, or they can decide whether they want to perform a body modification, which is implanting a cochlear implant. And she talks about how this is actually not so simple as it seems, because it's actually a dilemma for what you're going to decide in terms of the future of the child. By having a cochlear implant, as advantageous as it is, but they're not perfect. They don't provide the same quality or nuance of sound as regular hearing do. And more importantly, for these children who have cochlear implants, they will typically miss out on learning sign language. And when they miss out on that, right, it's kind of like they are leaving a certain kind of community, right? And also missing out on learning a certain language that's very rich and that is has its own set of cultural values. And so she talks about how for some deaf children who do actually grow up having the cochlear implant, they sometimes feel a little bit bad because they feel like they can't assimilate fully into the hearing world. And maybe if they had actually learned sign language, they could have integrated into a culture that fits better with their identity. So anyway, like I said, simple example, but the broader point she wants to make here is that we need to re-examine our notions of disability, right? That disability is not always a bad thing, right? And that modifications of disabled bodies is not always a good idea either, right? So the idea is that when you modify disabled people, you are changing some aspect of their identity, right? And if we want to adhere to this principle of the unmodified body, right? Like I said, this book is about defending that, right? Then we need to recognize the reality of like this body impairment is something that does causes pain and constraint and suffering. But if we want to defend this, right, then we need to say that, hey, the body is still good enough as it is. And we need to reject discourses that, hey, a disabled body is defective, it needs to be cured. They have a certain right to exist in society despite of their disabilities, and we should do things to kind of accommodate and facilitate that. So that part deals with, like I said, the disabled people. Now, there's another part of the book where she turns it around the other way, where it's about now people who are not disabled, so think people like you and me who are more normal, quote unquote, right? But we suffer something serious, like a serious impairment, a serious kind of disability. And what she wants to say is that in those kind of cases, right, we also have a right to modify our bodies to feel normal. So just to give you a very quick one, right? She talks about, say, a woman who's going through breast cancer and surviving it, and she has to basically go for reconstructive surgery to get her breasts back. She also talks about a man who was seriously scarred and burned in a car accident and opted to have reconstructive surgery, right, to get back to, quote unquote, again, a normal face. So what she wants to do is just basically defend also these kind of cases as well. And that's why, Santosh, you mentioned about the internal perspective, and she mentions this in this part of the book, that you need to also look at these people and understand how they feel inside, that, what they want for themselves does matter as well, despite, what other people or society may think, what she calls the external perspective. And again, just to use that woman as an example, because it's a bit sad to see. So when a woman decided to have her breast reconstructed, it turned out by the time she came out of surgery, the surgeon had put in breasts that were bigger than what she wanted. And so this was a clear case where the surgeon totally ignored what she wanted and didn't care about her internal perspective and just assumed that, hey, all women want bigger breasts, so I wasn't doing anything wrong here, And like I said, this may be a very extreme case, but the idea here is that, like I said, that we can think of many other examples where the internal perspective of the person who cares about what their body should be like, should feel like, and should be valued as, shouldn't be disregarded. So anyway, just to wrap it up. So she puts it this way, a good way of kind of reconciliating the two, which is an external perspective, right? So what people look at you and what people think is normal, right, would invite the abnormal person to change so that they become normal. An internal perspective invites the abnormal person to support to seek support and allow themselves to feel normal again. And so the idea basically here, like I said, going back to the concept of normality, is that we just need to reject a certain template, a certain default, status for our bodies, and to reject alienation from our embodied selves. So to her, normalization really is something that can be embraced from the internal perspective. That means the person, is allowed to feel normal again. And it's not some kind of external objective standard that we should find out there. Right, so that covers the second part of the book. And give me just some thoughts, feelings, maybe about what you heard.
So I actually agree with that conclusion about, like not having external standards by which we would then feel abnormal, questioning what that normality is. I think what I struggle with in the beginning is that I actually don't think the title of a book accurately captures the nuances of all these views that you've been expressing, because, it's not so much about keeping the body intact and unmodified, because it sounds like she acknowledges that our bodies are always changing anyway. And so this idea that we can somehow keep our bodies intact, unmodified, or pure is actually, that's the error, we shouldn't be striving after that. Because I think fundamentally what is wrong with our modern society is that we don't accept death, we don't accept change and decay, we don't accept that our bodies get old and weak, and we go through enormous lengths to somehow live in denial of that. And I think what's really the two crucial points, I think, in everything that you've said that I fundamentally agree with her is, this idea of consent, that whatever is done to our bodies should be consented to from within that person's lived experience, and it should be something they feel good about. And then the second part, is questioning this idea of the standard, what is normal. So I recently read this book called The Purpose of Power by Alicia Garza. She was one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And she talks about how, in a science experiment, you have a control, and then you change something, and then you see, based on what's different, you see the results, but you always need the control to compare to, right? And so she talks about how in society there is a control, and it's often white, male, and how the control shows up in society is things like, when company produces plaster or Band-Aid that is flesh colored, it's always white. It's like they don't produce a black colored thing that's supposed to match your flesh. That's the control, that's the standard. The control manifests in clothes that always come in a certain range of sizes, and you can't find clothes in the extreme sizes. So I believe that's a point that Clare Chambers is making, which I agree with. So
yeah, just a quick one. That's actually a very good point, Unsu, because she doesn't mention it in this book, but what you said about Black Lives Matters and how now there's been this revelation or sort of study about the BMI index. So the BMI is the body mass index, and how the body mass index was actually heavily researched only on a certain white male population, and then erroneously applied to all kinds of other populations. So Asian populations, Black people, people of other ethnicities and other nationalities, and how you can't do things like that because people who live in these other populations have very different types of bodies. So you can't use, for example, the US-based BMI index on, say, Asians, for example, because actually we need a very different kind of BMI index. And this is even the external perspective, which is not even comes close to reality to talking about health. In this case, which I mentioned this, at least I think I mentioned to you also privately, where I said that BMI is actually a very poor indicator because a person could be exceeding the BMI index and getting into the so-called overweight category, but if this person is very lean and just full of muscles, this person may not be as unhealthy as he seems, as compared to someone else who meets the BMI index of acceptability. So yeah, so that's another way of looking at it. Santosh, sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the crux of her message is, how do we build a society that's inclusive and egalitarian? Yeah, so I think the one theme that emerged for me in terms of how do we construct a society, right, is, and what's the message and what's the takeaway? It's inclusion. Yeah, and maybe that's colored by my current lens. So I'm actually supporting 8 caregivers with persons with special needs, and on the other end, I'm supporting children from low-income families on their trauma healing journey. And I think the one thing I've learned is, if you want to build a society that's inclusive and egalitarian, it's important that we center the discourse on the margins. Yeah, and we cultivate empathy and sensitivity to the lived experiences, the subjective internal lived experiences of those on the margins. Yeah, and it's a practice, and this practice starts from young. Now, there's another important component to just dialogue that centers the discourse on the margins. And it's the key word here, right, for me, and the key understanding here is really intermingling and intermixing. So yeah, I think societies are naturally stratified and segregated, and they are not intermixed, or they're not porous enough for people to hear the lived experience of another person from another sector or segment of society. Yeah, so I think another important element is children ought to grow up in a society where there's more intermingling and intermixing. Yeah, for that dialogue that is where sensitivity and empathy take precedence over performance or over competition can happen. Yeah. So I think the key thing about inclusion is really, yeah, intermingling and intermixing. Yeah. But
yeah,
then,
I mean, I think, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, and then I think what Unsu and you pointed out, right? Then agency is important. If a person who, even after intermingling and intermixing and having shared their lived experience, doesn't feel that they can fit in the culture, they can then gravitate. A deaf person, right? For example, if I've tried to communicate my feelings of being oppressed, and I try to blend in. If I can't, then I can go back to sign language. That agency and that autonomy should also be accorded to individuals. Yeah, it's a very complex topic. Yeah, and we need to also add in the dimension of power. Yeah, who do we appoint to be the person who facilitates the discourse? Yeah, and so it's I think this is a very complex topic. I just but it's worth even discussing.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things. So one is, yes, definitely right. What Clare Chambers is definitely aiming to do is to build a much more inclusive society. One is obviously much more politically diverse, and when I mean politically, I don't mean political ideology, right? I mean, what she's saying is that we all have different bodies, we all have different ideas about, beauty standards, what our bodies should be like, would be like. So she wants to also, hold on to that, right? To say that, hey, you do have a right? Like the agency is yours to own and to have your body to fit what you like. So she wouldn't want to have a world where everyone looks the same, for sure, right? Or a world where everyone thinks they should look a certain way. So that is, one of the examples that she gave, now that I remembered, is, so it's harder for us to relate because we don't have in our culture African Americans, but African Americans have a certain kind of hairstyle. So I mean, what she's trying to point out is that they've been subjugated in American culture to conform to a much more white-like beauty standard. Like their hair should be straightened, it shouldn't look so rough and coarse, it shouldn't be so curly. Yeah, and she talks about how even there's a certain a cultural practice that is quite oppressive and not accepting of that diversity. And you're right, Santosh, it's good to have conversations like this, trying to include as many voices as possible. And I do agree with you, it is very complex. It's very hard to decide about you know, how do we build a society like that, right? And, you know, to me, just to use a very simple example for us in Singapore, right? When we go to school, we all look a certain way, man. Like, you know, our uniforms, our hairstyle, you know, we're not supposed to look a little bit different. You know, imagine, for example, just not too long ago in Singapore, we had this case about a trans student, sorry, you know, feeling that the school doesn't accept or treat her right, you know, when it comes to what she wants to do with her body. So yeah, in some sense, we have a strong need to fight and campaign on that, you know, to see whether we can be more open about that. Unsu, just one last thing I wanted to say also. Yes, I know where you're coming from when you said that it feels like the title of a book is seems to be misapplied, right? Because she is obviously accepting of the idea about modification. But towards the end, and then we're coming towards that now, right? I will tell you why she's still, why the title of a book is still applicable, because when it comes to children, there is a kind of principle here about leaving the body as intact as possible. So I come through that in the next section. Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask you guys more stuff, but I figured maybe I should just go on so that we can come towards the end and then we can have maybe even a more robust discussion. So, so going back to what Unsu said, right? So what exactly is the position of Clare Chambers here, right? This idea about modification. So she poses these questions, and you guys sort of also mentioned it as well, like you, Santosh, right? So she thinks that if you're going to modify your body, and you will probably modify your body, right? Think about these questions in mind. So, for example, to what extent are your actions shaped by dominant social norms? Are you reacting to it, right? Are you acting autonomously, or are you pushed towards this modification? Is this modification necessary for you to gain social status or acceptance? Are you pursuing this modification because of some kind of induced social shame, right? And is this modification necessary, you know, to you in terms of enhancing your health, right? And will it make you feel better? So, you know, she's just saying that basically you got to have these questions in mind if you're going to do something, right? And she considers kind of like three kind of logics to why you would do self-modification, right? Which is perhaps you think that it's a virtue, you're trying to make an effort. So, you know, bodybuilding would be kind of an example, right? It's a second one is a necessary act of self-care, one that nurtures the soul or affirms one identity. So, you know, I gave some examples about, you know, African Americans being allowed to dress the way they want, you know, and, you know, I think Santosh, you mentioned something there also about certain marginalized people being able to look after their bodies the way that they want to you know, to do self-care, perform self-care, right? And the third one is basically, you know, modification can also be an act of creativity. So out of all these things, right, what she wants to then introduce, and this is the concept that I think is very rich and very potent, is the idea about bodily integrity, right? So if you're going to modify your body, let's see whether you're defending the integrity of your body. So what does it mean? So like I mentioned just now, right, we tend to judge people for their identity, their appearance, their health, right? And that's also the same reasons why people modify their bodies, right? And we talk about the idea that we want to strive for a certain principle of equality here. So she talks about how, you know, using an example, right, fat shaming, which I mentioned just now in the introduction, in this case, the artist Taylor Swift, right? You know, even if not the three of us, but, you know, many other people tend to judge, you know, fat bodies as, like I said, unhealthy, abnormal, right? And there's a very negative attitude towards it, right? And I mentioned it even earlier in my introduction about how we even demean their political status, right? We feel like they're not worthy of protection. And I think, you know, even if you don't think about the pandemic in the context of the pandemic, but think of things like insurance, right? Like, how does an insurance company value, you know, a body that is, you know, deemed unhealthy or fat or anything like that, right? So in any case, you know, what she wants to draw on is this idea that, you know, we need to look at also the political, cultural, economic structures that create this idea about fatness and fat phobia and how, you know, it diminishes the status of these people. So in any case, she also notes that like us being in this culture, right, where we're constantly modifying our bodies, like for those reasons I stated earlier, right, they also can contribute to poor mental health. And I know Santosh is probably something that you probably would have heard from the people you work with, right? So appearance anxiety, shame. So we also need to take into account that, this pressure to modify our bodies contribute to a public health crisis as well. For women, one of the examples that I love that she brought up is this idea that women are always told to get back their bodies after pregnancy. The idea, like, as if once they've given birth, they should strive 100% to, looking like as if they are, 18 years old or 22 years old or something like that, right? And, to her, that's such a sexist and patriarchal way of trying to place women's bodies as a sex object, and, disconnecting them from their new status as a mother, right, or as a woman who's given birth. So, in all of this, right, what she's trying to say really is that, like, we need to examine, and she also brings up trans people, obviously, and I know that's a very potent topic, but the idea here is that, all of us are, as I said earlier, actually, with the bodybuilding example, we all are trying to figure out, how to connect or integrate our internal perspective with the external perspective and to allow our bodies to feel like us. Yeah. Okay, I guess it's a little bit repetitive, but let me move on to then this idea about bodily integrity. So she gives a few case examples here, and they're very fascinating and they're real. So just listen carefully and think about it for a minute. Yeah. So one case example she gives is this child called Ashley, and she's a cognitively and physically disabled child who's unable to move, who's unable to do anything necessary to take care of herself, right? And so when she's 6 years old, her parents authorized a series of surgeries and interventions to kind of keep her permanently as a child, and so that she can be continued to be lifted and cared for by her parents, and in some sense almost prevent her from going through puberty and becoming a sexually mature adult. And that includes very invasive surgeries like removal of a breast and stuff like that. And the important thing here that Claire wants us to note is that this child actually will never be able to express her views about her treatment. Then she talks about a boy who suffers lymphatic cancer. At age 14, he is gravely ill and needs chemotherapy, and he needs blood transfusions. But in this case, he and his parents are Jehovah's Witnesses, and so they believe that having a blood transfusion is against God's will. So that's another very interesting case study. There's another one where she talks about a child being 7 years old and feeling like she's trans, and how the parents have opposing views, right? Like one parent thinks that it's okay to follow the advice of doctors and to treat her for gender dysphoria and to help her transit to being a woman, but the father is dead set against it, and there's this conflict between parents. Now, so what is the bigger question here in me citing all these cases, right? The idea that Clare Chambers wants to ask is that what is the legal permissibility of doing modification to children, right? I mean, how different is this from, say, putting a tattoo on your child or, raising them in a certain way, right? Isn't it in some sense all these things pretty arbitrary, right? And, if we see that in certain cases that a parent's wish about modifying their children should be overridden in the case of the child's best interest, right? Why do we still allow parents to do many other things that are not in their best interest? So whether it's like, giving them McDonald's or letting them lead inactive lifestyles. So here, hence, comes in the concept that she wants to reduce, bodily integrity. Because the idea here is that bodily integrity is a concept that's used in, philosophy and in legal studies about looking at medical interventions. The idea here is that it's a principle to help to act as a defense against wrongful bodily intervention. So a simple example, right? If you are in a car accident, right, and you're unconscious, right, so you're not able to consent, right? But obviously, when you're being sent to the hospital and they perform some kind of life-saving surgery and you come out of it and you realize that they did something to you, right? In some sense, they still respected your body integrity. If they, kept you alive, make sure that you come out of the accident, has the best that you can. But if you find out that they perform a vasectomy, then obviously they violated your integrity, right? They didn't get your consent to do this other extravenous surgery. So that's a case where you're violating that principle. Yeah. So basically what she's just trying to say here is that the idea of bodily integrity is that it's a sort of principle of resistance, right? Resistance against intervention, against modification, right? If you're going to do something, right, there needs to be a very clear justification for it. if there's significant doubt, the intervention shouldn't occur. And why she's defending this is because she's saying that it's a very weighty moral default position. When it comes to other people's bodies, it's better to err with too little intervention than too much, right? And of course, like I said just now, I gave you the example of you being sent to the hospital, in case you're in an accident. But just think of many other cases, which may happen to us at some point in our lives where, maybe we are old and we are severely cognitive impaired, and we have dementia. So, what kind of intervention, would be acceptable or appropriate, right? If you're in that kind of situation. Babies, right? They can't consent as well. So what kind of interventions, would we accept there? So anyway, like I said just now, she's defending this particular principle of the bodily integrity. And like I said, it's kind of a concept of resistance. And so what she's trying to say, right? Again, I just sort of bring it back to the original point. And, this is why sort of in reading this book, she sort of continue to emphasize where she's coming from, this framework, which is if we believe in this principle of the unmodified body, right, and we accept that, like I said earlier, that the body is so important, it's so bound with our identity, our experience, it doesn't just, it's not an object that belongs to you, it's literally you, right? We care so much about what happens to our bodies, then we need to, like I said just now, look at any kind of intervention as something that changes our identity. And, in some sense, it's almost like an attack on the self, right? So whether it's physical, psychological, political, we need to protect our body in that sense. That's why, going back to what Unsu said just now, there's a certain kind of intactness, right, that she's trying to defend here. So I'm just going to conclude basically. So, I gave you those case studies just now. So I'm curious about how she would apply her principles here. So she would say, in the case of, say, Ashley, the severely cognitive impaired child, she would say, even though she cannot consent to her own treatment and she would never be autonomous, which is another concept that she talks about, right? This person cannot make sort of free choices of her own. But, we should kind of still refrain from intervention because we lack strong reasons for intervention. In those other cases that I cited earlier, the idea here is, like I said, is to try to keep the unmodified body as stable as possible, right? And to sort of leave things as it is. Yeah. Okay. Maybe one more thing I should just add. Sorry, I just realized I skipped past certain notes. And it's very important, actually.
Sorry, since you were talking about the example she mentioned earlier, could you actually tell us what she would have done with the Jehovah's Witness case? Yeah.
So good point. So when I said just now about the body integrity, right, there was also three other ideas that she has in mind, and that is the idea about open future, reversibility, and best interests. So in the case of that child with the Jehovah's Witness scenario, she would say that it's important to still do the intervention in that case because you want the child to have an open future. You want to believe that it's in the child's best interest to stay alive. Now there's this thing about reversibility, and this reversibility maybe not so applicable to that case, but think about the trans case, the transitioning scenario. So she will have a much more nuanced take on that one. It will be something more like we need to not apply intervention too quickly, give the child time to develop an autonomous will, right, to decide what's in his or her best interest, right? And like I said, reversibility, is it possible to reverse the procedure or the intervention? Because some things are reversible, but some things are not, obviously. So yeah. So that's kind of like I said, that's where, going back to what you said, Unsu, that's where the title comes in, the idea about intactness. So like I said, not that you can't modify the body, but, there's a very rigorous system of ideas, principles in mind that you should bear in mind if you're going to intervene and modify the body. Obviously, in this case, I understand that it's very drastic, it's very life-changing in some sense, so it doesn't have to be applicable to everything, right? Not like if I put on makeup, like I need to ask all these kind of questions, but you get the general thrust of it, to her on a societal level for all these very, very important cases that do change people's lives. We need to have much more profound reflections and discussions about, whether it's right to intervene. So yeah, okay. So anyway, maybe just to, kind of sum it up before I give the conclusion, let's have a good discussion. So far, what's your reactions to the arguments? What are you thinking by now? Now that I've, given more or less, like I said, a very, very slim, lean summary of the book.
Santosh, you want to respond first?
Yeah, I can. Now, Douglas, when you mentioned the word integrity, what came to my mind was the feeling of being whole and integrated, as compared to feeling fragmented and dissociated. Like, yeah. And I think everyone can distinguish the two polar ends. And I think what we can do together as a collective, in the spirit of Ubuntu, right? I am because we are, is to help communicate what feeling whole and integrated is for us, and seeking the support from others to get to that state of feeling whole and integrated. Yeah, so that's what I got from the word integrity, preserving body integrity. The second perspective that I have is that it's integrity in the sense of integrating body, mind, and spirit. Yeah, so it's not just integrity at the level of the body, but integrity across the body, the mind, and the spirit, right? Yeah, so and that includes emotions and feelings, and yeah. So I think like that's like another level of integrity where there's harmony. Maybe a better word is harmony across those three levels. When people feel a sense of harmony across the body, their mind, and the spirit, that experience of well-being is an ideal that I would like my society to work towards for each and every individual. Yeah. So that's the second perspective. I think the third one, right, is shifting away from like the discussion of like the intact body to embodiment. And embodiment is really the felt and the lived experience of like how the body feels like. Yeah, which is why like a lot of the research I'm doing and a lot of the trauma-informed work that I'm doing, it's about embodiment. Yeah, so I think maybe I might have miscommunicated earlier that like, deny the body, right? I'm not the body. Yeah, but actually what I meant by was embodiment. Yeah. So I think embodiment really matters. Yeah, and that ties in with the first two ideas of feeling whole and integrated in the embodied sense. Yeah, and feeling integrated and harmonious across body, mind, and spirit. Yeah, so those were like some of my takeaways based on the limited work I do with marginalized segments of society. Yeah, the ideal and the aspiration that I work towards for these groups of people, right, who I care about. Now, there's something else that I would throw into the mix, which is to make peace with yourself, the cultivation of peace with yourself and with the circumstance, because the work that we do at the societal and the cultural level can take a long time. And we don't want people to wait until things get well at the societal level for them to feel that sense of peace within themselves. And that's another aspiration I have when I work with these segments. Yeah, because we just can't wait. There's just, the forces of oppression, the forces of trauma are just so deep that what I aspire to at another level is to make peace with how they are feeling at any moment within their circumstance. Yeah, and that cultivation of peace is a practice that I hope to achieve. Yeah, so those are like some of my thoughts. Yeah, based on just the limited experience I have, but it's a very complex topic.
Yeah, thanks for actually sharing that part about the trauma thing, because I also have this in my notes. I just want to bring it up as well. Again, it's a bit repetitive, but just to again emphasize that, she also talks about the literature on trauma, right, and violence. And her point actually is that when you look at that, then you know that the body is not just something you can dissociate from, right? It's not just an object or two that, can be damaged and altered, and we just regard it like it's just a car, right? So that's why she says that, especially when you look at, trauma, right? Then what happens to the body is what happens to you. And so we can't just, disregard it that way. And there's there was something I just wanted to add very quickly because I feel like it's just very important to say it, that the other way of looking at this argument, right, about why she chooses to protect the intact body, right, as a certain, like I said, moral privilege baseline, is because if you try to go the other direction, which is, that means you generally favor modification, then what she's saying is that, hey, there's no end to the questions about what kind of modification is good or better or best, and every constant kind of modification, and say something like surgery, right, cosmetic surgery, or every kind of self-improvement, you just naturally assume, oh, it'll be better and better and better. And to me, right, this kind of reminds me of, this is not something I expect you guys to know, but there was a very funny meme that appeared where it was a South Korean beauty pageant, and they put up a picture of all the contestants, and they all look the same. And the reason why they all look the same is because they were all conforming to that ideal standard in Korean society about what a woman should look like beautifully, right? And that's where you see what we're talking about here, what Clare Chambers is criticizing. There's no expression of diversity, right? Like every woman needs to look almost identical to each other. So yeah. Okay, go ahead, Unsu.
I was just curious, was this book written after COVID? Like what are her views on, let's say, vaccine mandates?
That's a good one. It was definitely written, I mean, look, it got published in 2022, right? And it's very interesting you brought this up because, like I said, I want to use this topic as a springboard to talk about vaccination. And interestingly enough, I don't feel like I recall this from the book because I definitely would have wanted to talk about it, but she may have, but maybe it's not so profound a point because, the stuff that I brought up in our discussion, I find very interesting, fascinating, and really tests the limits of that question, right, about body integrity. I mean, I would imagine for someone like her, vaccination, yes, you're right, it's a form of body modification, but she's not someone against science, for example. She's not going to say that kind of body modification fundamentally alters your identity or changes your functionality. So I would imagine she would probably be more for the idea that there is nothing wrong with getting vaccinated, right? But maybe it's a form of body modification that isn't so profound, like I said, as the other examples I gave.
So yeah, I think my worry about her argument is that there's a certain circularity in it. So she's trying to use this concept of the integrity of the body in order to bolster, like, our ability to resist things that we would consider unfair, unnatural, or whatever. But I feel that assumes what it's trying to prove, because it's like, I think at the end of the day, how do we know what are the types of modification we want to resist, right? And we say, oh, we just want to resist whatever keeps our body intact and with integrity. But then, how do we come to agree on what that integrity is? So for instance, like the Jehovah's Witness example, you could argue that for that family, because of their beliefs, by getting a blood transfusion, you have done something that's irreversible. You have not given that boy an open future, because now his ability to be a member of his culture has been cut off from him because he got the blood transfusion. Similarly with, let's say, the vaccination case, right? You could argue that for people who really believe that the vaccines were damaging, like that's irreversible. And it could possibly cause them some long-term effects that, we have not shown that these vaccines 100% do not have long-term effects. So I feel her argument is not that useful in these debates, because at the end of the day, we're still going to have debates about what does it mean to have an intact body. And there could be, a dozen different definitions of what that is.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I definitely do see where you're coming from when it comes to the religious one, because you are right. It's just like the same way that she examined the case of the deaf child, right? Getting a cochlear implant. Now, she's not one way or another saying one thing is better than the other, right? She's not saying having a cochlear implant is, fundamentally better than not having one, so that's not necessarily the argument she's trying to make. but it's just more about like how there's all these complexities as you mentioned. And you're right, like in the case of Jehovah's Witness, it would be just as analogous to the deaf child, cutting off that person from their own culture community that they may feel very connected to. So so maybe don't take my word for it whether she said that in that case whether body intervention should be endorsed, because maybe in a funny way she might actually say that the boy has a right to reject, but you said this thing about open future, right? And of course, I mean, the way we're looking at it, typically speaking, is open future means that you're not going to die, you're going to live a life of longevity or whatever. But as I mentioned earlier, there are tough questions to ask about, let's say someone's having cancer, they have a right to choose whether would they prefer to live a life of continuous medical interventions or just die with the cancer, accept it for what it is, and be done with it. So you're right, it's not a clear-cut answer in any case. Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a good point that you brought up, that in the end, when it comes to this principle, I guess you could say for me, what I feel in responding to what you said is that you do fundamentally have to decide for yourself, how much do you want to keep intact, right? So like for example, when I read the part about naturalness, now I have a certain conception about it as well, right? About what I feel naturally I want to do or not do to my body, right? But I have a tattoo and that's not a very natural thing to have. But I also know, like, hey, I don't want to have more than just this tattoo. I don't want to have my whole body full of tattoos, and that's a very personal choice for me. But I have friends who are like that, and I respect that as well. And in that case, that's a lot more body modification that I'm willing to accept for myself. But like I said, going back to the idea about acceptance of diversity, I wouldn't value them any less. Yeah, but the pandemic thing, the vaccination thing, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's hard to refute against the idea that for some of these people, yeah, maybe the vaccine does have a long-term effect on them, and we need to consider their interests as well. Yeah, Santosh?
No, I mean, like, for me, I know this might sound like very cliche, but it's about how unconditional our love is for the other. At the end of the day, right? So it's really about love. Like, I don't know, like the thing that came to me, I know it's strange, but it's about love. How do we love one another better? And yeah, it's strange, but yeah, I don't know why I'm raising this topic of loving. Yeah,
I think it's
but
just you.
yeah, it's just loving, like, just, yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So look, Unsu, do you want to add anything more? Anything
It's not
else
a cognitive like argument or stance, but it's just about loving. Yeah. What does it mean to love one another? Yeah.
Okay, maybe let me take what you're saying, Santosh, and I'll just put one more thought out there for you guys to respond to. I feel like with her book, right, and the ideas that she's trying to express. First thing, let me of course say again repeatedly that I'm not trying to do. I mean, I can't cover the book comprehensively. There's just way too much stuff to talk about as well that I can't put in my presentation, right? But I guess going from what you're saying, Santosh, right? Even if we believe in that, right? Egalitarianism, love, right? How do you actualize that? That is the point at the end of the day. How do you make this a institutional or cultural practice? I brought up many examples from everything from the menstruation to even historical examples of like women binding and corset wearing, and I talk about beauty standards as well. I mean, even the makeup industry is something that we can even talk about, right? So my point here is that what should we go towards, right, as a goal for society, right? How do we make ourselves or change our practices, our institutions to love bodies, different bodies, as much as possible. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
So actually, yeah, responding to that point, like I actually have a personal example that has occurred to me of potential body modification. So I have osteoarthritis in my left hip, which means that the gel that's supposed to cushion the femur as it inserts into pelvis, like that's worn off. So bone is actually grinding against bone. And this means that every few days I might have some pain in the hip, or as a result of, not stretching or not, taking care of that part, right? And these days, hip replacements are pretty common. I mean, you go to any, surgeon and they'll say, yeah, it's straightforward, you should do it, right? But I've been holding off on it because I actually feel, okay, the pain is not so much, it's bearable. And I actually believe in just other ways of dealing with it, right? Whether it's doing my like Feldenkrais stretches or, you know, just whatever, like self-care. And so this, I mean, this is a personal choice I have to make, right? And every day, so like, I think, okay, like, what if 10 years from now, it gets so bad that I finally have to get a hip replacement? You know, I go ahead and do it, and actually it goes really well. There's no downsides to it. And I might look back and regret, like, oh my God, like I put myself through 10 years of like struggle, and I should have just done it a long time ago, right? So I actually don't think it's easy to answer these questions. I mean, it's just, as Santosh said, it's really personal. And I don't think there are any right or wrong answers. You just make the best choice you can, you know, given your particular set of values and what's available to you. And you try and make peace with it, right? But, you know, and I also want to tie it back to like what you're saying about, okay, how do we actually bring some of these values on a societal level? So, okay, would you all agree that a hip surgery would be actually more of a body modification than, let's say, Pilates or yoga or getting massages? Would it be more of an extreme modification?
A more intense one, sure.
More intense, right?
Yeah.
So then maybe if what Claire is saying is right, that we should, as a society, value, you know, the intact body, then as a society, we should be paying, like, you know, surgeons much less money than Pilates and yoga instructors, right? I mean, that's how you would actually manifest a society that values certain things differently, right? So I'm not saying, you know, I'm just trying to throw that out as a provocation.
But to complicate matters, but if the severity is high, then you might want to go for the surgery, right? As compared to the yoga and Pilates, which is a bit more preventive.
Yeah.
And that's long term. Yeah. So I think like it depends on a number of other parameters. Yeah.
And I would actually, you know, so that's a great example, and one I'm really glad that you brought it up, because, you know, I like to bring up examples which are very relatable. Someone watching this may feel like, hey, I may end up in the situation one day, right? Have a certain kind of injury or something that they need to do, and they have to think very hard about where they want to do that intervention. You know, and I posed those questions earlier, and, you know, maybe in this case, what you're bringing up may not be so politically salient. Like, you don't have to think very hard politically about, you know, having osteoporosis, right? And having that kind of surgery. But nevertheless, you're right. Like, as a society, right? You know, how much do we pay surgeons, right? And also, you could even argue that, okay, you know, aging is a very fundamental part of life. We are now in this space and sort of economic climate where we are talking about, you know, not being ageist, you know, trying to make sure our institutions and our maybe the structures around us, buildings, whatever, you know, elderly friendly. So, you know, that is sort of one way of looking at the problem of the body, right? The aging body, that you are, as a society, going to make changes so that you can accommodate them more, right? And I would argue maybe the surgery should be offered, you know, almost, not say free of charge, but, you know, a much more subsidized rate, right? Because maybe you recognize that some interventions may be very life-saving or life-affirming. Something that Clare Chambers brought up, right? Which is, like I said, the guy who had the facial reconstruction because of being scarred in a car accident, right? I mean, to him, having a normal face is so important, because otherwise, when he walks out in society, people just look at him and wouldn't accept him as a normal member of society. So, you know, just one of the ways we can think about this. Yeah, but you're right. No straightforward answers here. Yeah. Okay. I'll tell you what. I guess I'll just do a closing, basically. So anyway, I just hope you guys enjoyed hearing from me and, you know, present, like I said, the ideas of this book. So just to cap it off, look, I just want to give one last example that she brought up. Again, it's more relatable to women, but, you know, just you can see the points in it. So she brought up the idea about, like, now in this stage of like seeing the rise of the body positivity movement, right? And it's meant to be a good movement, right? Because it's asking you to maybe follow what Santosh was saying, right? Which is to reject this feeling of feeling dissatisfied with your body, accept yourself, your body for who you are, right? And she thinks generally that's a good thing too. But she notes, ironically, you know, it's been used by commercial entities like Dove, the company, and Dove came up with this ad, right, where they showed this women like having to choose between two doors. So one says choose beautiful, one says choose average. And of course, what they're trying to do with the ad is to show all the women go to choose beautiful, right? So in some sense, it's trying to affirm that, hey, women, you have the right to choose to look at yourself as a beautiful person, right? And not that you're an average person. But, she criticizes this at the same time because, to her, it still replicates all cliche tropes. That's one. And, saying that you don't choose the door average is again trying to apply some kind of objective standard out there, right? And it's just that you subjectively are not trying to put yourself there. She also said that, in terms of the design of the ad, you don't actually see fat women, and there's still a certain sort of conformity or homogeneity, with what she saw in the ad. So anyway, the point here is that, and I think it goes back to everything we've been saying, which is, yes, we can talk about this body problem as one to do with your individual self-esteem. And I know, Santosh, you are a huge, advocate of how we can work on those individual practices, right? We can choose to feel beautiful about ourselves and feel good about ourselves. But, to Clare Chambers, again, we got to look at the political and economic structures that set us up to feel bad in the first place, right? And how these structures and these practices, they sort of privatize a political problem to make us feel bad, and not look at each other that way. So I just end with just this last ending paragraph from her, and I like it. So she says, choice is important, but choice is not everything. We do not choose the bodies we are born with. We do not choose our social context. We do not choose how our bodies will be racialized. We don't choose how our gender is understood and enforced. We don't choose the content of beauty ideal. We don't choose to be on the receiving end of endless barrage of images of the perfect body. We do not choose to live in a world where we're constantly receiving the message that how we look is one of the most important things about us. And we live in a society now that's becoming more visual, more focused about how we look and our appearances. And what she wants to say is to say stop. She says that, it's time to allow bodies to be good enough and to recognize that, like I said earlier in the introduction, if everyone's feeling bad about their body, then the body is not the problem. It's society, and it's time to kind of reclaim that. So there we go. We had a very thorough, rich discussion about those ideas. And yeah, like I agree with everyone here that it's not easy. Everyone has an individual answer, but I hope that our discussion will help you. For one, to first get the book if you can, read it. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, and to help you think deeper about your body in relation to others. Okay, thanks everyone.
All right, thanks Douglas.
Thanks, Douglas.
Enjoyed it.